right off the bat that this crisis will make inequality worse in America. There's some hope, I suppose, that when financial markets and these financial companies collapsed and all these guys took losses. In fact, I had this hope momentarily, Jomo. There would be a reversal in the inequality numbers. Of course, by 2009, they were making money and paying themselves huge bonuses again. There's a serious rents issue in the financial community that nobody is, I don't think our regulators will ever deal with, and I don't think that the economics profession will deal with. But my answer to that question is quite simple. The taxpayers are bailing out the financial system. They've bailed out the financial system time and again back to the period Jane was talking about. That is almost by definition, it leads to an unequal distribution of income. It's going to happen again. It's happened time and again, and I think it has, I used to poo-poo this idea. Who's that woman who writes about this? That, that these people loved crises. And I'm beginning to realize indirectly that crises tend in the modern economy to work to the benefit of the rich and the detriment of the rest of us, the benefit in particular of the financial authorities. One of the comic statements of our time, of course, and he's made many of them, was by Alan Greenspan. And I'm not talking about the ones you're thinking about. Maybe I am. When he said, when he issued his mea culpa, that he never believed this could happen to the economy, and he blew it, he said, my model, or his view of the way the economy worked, had worked for 40 years, and suddenly it stopped working. Well, the fact is, it did not work for 40 years. We had financial crisis, and Jane was alluding to them, financial crisis after financial crisis. We had one in 1970 at Penn Central. We had one in 1975 with New York City. But the really serious crises, think about them, and Jamie Dimon gets up there with the chutzpah of a wealthy man and says, well, these things happen every 5 years. Well, they happened more frequently than every 5 years. There was the LDC crisis in 1982, caused by what Jane talked about, the privatization of the flow of petrodollars beginning in the 1970s. One of the great political economy issues of our time, government made no decision about how to recirculate and recycle that money. In fact, Volcker talked to the World Bank about setting up an international institution so that the government would have some control over the recycling of those dollars. But Walter Wriston and others took the money and started to lend right away. And nobody stopped them. They weren't going to stop them in the Ford administration. That's for sure. 1982, the consequence was the Mexican crisis, the first Mexican crisis, I should say. And those banks were saved by Volcker's rescue package along with the IMF, and then they were forced to put up some money, bailed out. When was the next? Well, there was the stock market crash of 1987. I'm probably missing one in between here. There was the thrift crisis of 1989. In fact, there were thrift crises all the time. What I mean by that is the savings and loan associations. Thrift crises all the time throughout the 1980s. They only came to a head when the government decided they had to finally solve the problem. All the time. Mexican crisis, constant thrift crisis. The stock market crash of '87. Greenspan just took over at the Fed at that point. He bailed us out and got all the other central banks to step on the gas quickly. Bailed us out of that one. 1989 and 1990, the serious thrift crisis, $150 to $200 billion put in by the Resolution Trust, what was it called? Resolution Trust Authority? Corporation, to save the depositors, to pay off the depositors for this failed thrift. That's not all that happened then. There was a junk bond failure, Mike Milken. There were writers even of a progressive nature who argue, wow, lucky Mike Milken was stopped by the Boesky scandals. All of you are too young to remember the Ivan Boesky scandals. But Mike Milken was stopped by an insider trading crisis and went to jail. Mike Milken would have been stopped by his own excesses. He was issuing bad debt by 1988 and 1989 that created a bubble that was going to burst. The junk bond market burst in those same years. A thrift crisis, a junk bond market. 1990 recession. The Fed bails us out again. 1992, or was it 94, the next Mexican crisis. Then, many of you may not know this, there was a huge derivatives crisis in 1994 when Alan Greenspan raised interest rates suddenly because he was worried about inflation. Remember, in 1993, Clinton passed a tax increase. You thought, wow, now I've got Greenspan on my side. He won't raise interest rates. He believes that the federal deficit is being dealt with because of this tax increase, which was quite an achievement. It was a progressive tax increase, quite an achievement on Clinton's part. The main achievement, I would argue, except maybe for the earned income tax credit increase. Well, EITC. And where am I? So we thought Greenspan was going to keep rates down. But GDP was rising at 4% in 1993. This was not the kind of thing, or was it 94? I'm getting my dates mixed up. Not the kind of thing Greenspan could possibly tolerate. Worse, the bond vigilantes, as they used to be called in those times, were pushing up long-term interest rates. Greenspan had to step on the gas, pushed interest rates way up. I don't even know why I'm talking about that. But then, oh, the derivatives crisis. So where was Greenspan, the main regulator of the banks in this period? These guys, Bankers Trust Company and others, were issuing derivatives to companies, innocent, not so innocent because the financial officers in these companies made a lot of money, but to Orange County, California, Procter & Gamble, Gibson greeting cards, fancy debt structured packages that allowed these guys to borrow money without putting the debt, the liability on their books. Procter & Gamble, $200 million. Sound familiar? Sound maybe a little bit like Greece today? It happened time and again. When Greenspan raised rates, there were huge losses on Wall Street, a catastrophe, not to mention the beginning of the Mexican crisis. 1997, the East Asian financial crisis. 3 years later, 1998, 1 year later, long-term capital management, and the Russian defaults. Bailed out again. 2000, the extraordinary crash of the high-tech companies, the fantasy companies, several thousand fantasy companies with enormous stock prices went out of business. I don't know if they all, several thousand of them had enormous stock prices, went out of business in that period. The market crashed. And then we had the rise of the housing bubble, which I think is, in my turn on Tolstoy, is that all happy families are unalike and all unhappy families are unalike. And to some degree, all crises are unalike. They all have their peculiarities, but of course, to some degree, they are alike. This was an extraordinary one from my point of view. I read Joe Stiglitz and all these guys who claim they anticipated it because they knew there was going to be a housing bubble. The intricacies of that credit default, those collateralized debt obligations were so great, and the market was so opaque and invisible to anybody that it was impossible to know how the defaults would affect the credit system. Where was the Fed through all of this? In any case, what happened every time in these financial crises? The speculators and Wall Street made money on the way up. They got bailed out on the way down, either by the Fed, which I would argue at some future date takes its pound of flesh out of the worker in the future, or by the Treasury. This time around, we're bailed out by the Treasury with TARP, a bunch of other assets that may have to be guaranteed by the taxpayer. I hope actually more stimulus, but it will definitely lead to, I think, a rise in inequality once again. What is the central problem? I think, as you might suspect from a guy who wrote a book called The Case for Big Government, the central problem was an ideological shift in the 1970s, in my view. It was an ideological shift driven not innocently, necessarily, because people like Walter Wriston were trying to deregulate these interest rates back in the 1960s. The way I would look at it was, we always had capital controls in America, at least since the Great Depression. We had capital controls on banks. They couldn't raise money at any rate they wanted to. And then guys went out there like Riston and that